Johnson, former CIA analyst, CEO of Berg Associates and a commentator on national security topics. Many thanks for joining us on the programme. It's good to see you. Now, let's start off with the US role in the conflict in Ukraine and Donbass, if we could. Some American politicians have described the situation as a proxy war between NATO and Russia, even though Western officials have not gone quite that far in their statements. What's your take?
I think that's exactly right. This is insanity, as far as I'm concerned, on the part of the United States and NATO. This conflict could have been avoided, and instead, it is, pains me to say it, but my country has been in the lead of trying to destroy Russia. And I can fully understand why Russia felt the need to strike back at this time. When you go back and look over the last several years at military exercises the United States has been conducting under the auspices of either NATO or the European Command, there's a video of U.S. Marines landing in a landing craft on the shores of Ukraine in the Black Sea. Well, that's not a defensive exercise, that's an actual offensive movement. So this need for war on the part of the West is being fed, and I think, unfortunately, for them and for us, they've bitten off more than they can chew in dealing with Russia right now.
Yeah, that you recently wrote an article about how, quote, going to war with Russia over Ukraine might be suicide for America. Could you tell us exactly what you meant by that statement?
Well, the fundamental concern is the economics. The sanctions imposed on Russia, in theory, were supposed to damage Russia so badly that the people would rise up and throw off Putin. It's having exactly the opposite effect. And it really reflects a genuine ignorance on the part of American policymakers. You can't show me a single instance in the last 50 years in which economic sanctions have worked to change the politics of a country. Didn't happen in Iran, didn't happen in North Korea, didn't happen in Cuba. And yet Russia is a critical supplier of resources that the United States does not have alternatives for. I know that farmers in the United States right now, they're paying 4 times what they were paying for fertilizer a year ago. That fertilizer comes out of both Russia and Belarus. Palladium, critical for making catalytic converters and other essential products. You can come into the United States and go to car lots. Car lots are empty, not because people are buying them up, because they can't get the supply. So I think that the damage that's being done right now economically to the United States, it's going to grow and increase, and this will ultimately turn out to be devastating for us, I fear.
Yeah, we've already seen the fallout of the sanctions against Russia and other countries. We've seen inflation, soaring oil and gas prices, food insecurity, to name but a few. How much do you think people are prepared to put up with before they say enough is enough?
No, they're not prepared to put up with it at all. This is, what Americans do not understand is that the Russians are fighting to defend the motherland. This is, and the ignorance that's displayed on the part of so many people in my country about Russia and its history. They continue to refer to them as communists today. Well, as you know, the Communist Party is a minority party now within Russia, and yet the Americans persist in that. So as this pain increases, the Americans are going to turn on the politicians that help create this mess. And every time Joe Biden tries to blame it on Putin, most American voters aren't buying it. They're going to be blaming Biden, blaming the Democrats, and potentially blaming the Republicans if they don't step up and try to set things right.
For weeks, the Pentagon refrained from sending fighter jets to Ukraine, despite pleas from Kiev. But Washington has now reversed its stance, saying it will send the jets. What do you make of this U-turn? And do you believe it will really make a difference at this point?
Well, they're going to send unicorns, too, and they'll send Godzilla, the imaginary monster. Where do you land those planes? The reality is Russia controls the airspace in Ukraine, and anything that's flying up there that the Russians don't want to fly up there is going to get shot down. So it's foolish on that part. The reality is the Ukrainian military has really ceased to function as an effective, coherent force. Yet within the United States, there's this continued drumbeat of propaganda touting major successes by the Ukrainians, but you can't see any of it on video because it doesn't exist. And the Russian military machine continues to just grind into dust what the Ukrainians are. So these are provocative actions. I think as soon as the equipment arrives in the Ukraine, Russia's going to destroy it with missile strikes, as they have been doing over the last 7 weeks. So it's an empty political gesture to convince people in America that the administration's doing something that is not going to have one bit of influence in changing what the outcome of this conflict in Ukraine.
So how exactly does pouring weapons into Ukraine seek to serve the goals of America's political establishment?
Well, keeps the defense industry. I mean, the corruption in this society. Look, I'm an old man. I'm old enough to remember the old Cold War when the Soviet Union existed. The kind of corruption we used to accuse the Soviets of is now rampant. It's endemic in the United States. Politicians go into office, become rich. Military generals in the Pentagon, they leave those posts, get lucrative positions with the defense industry, and they get paid to produce weapons that are, frankly, not very effective. And without any regard to really what this means for the strategic picture of the United States or for world security, for that matter.
There's increasing concern about where the weapons provided by the West will end up, since there's not actually a system in place to trace them. What's your take on the possible ramifications?
Well, it's not only possible, it's happening. I know from sources in France, for example, that the French gendarmes they've actually recovered firearms and shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles in Paris that went to Ukraine. The black market picked them up. They're now selling them to other groups around the world, and this is turning into a business that the real irony here is the United States has insisted that we've been fighting a war on terrorism for 20 years. Now what we're doing is we've actually effectively created a system to arm international terrorists around the world and create a greater threat to America, not a lesser threat.
The events in Ukraine are being framed as a battle against the unipolar world led by the US and its so-called rules-based order. Do you believe we're witnessing a new world order in the making here?
Oh, yes. No, I think it is. An expectation was that in the imposition of sanctions, and the Russian ruble would have crumbled, and the United States with the petrodollar would have continued to be effective. What people aren't monitoring, one of the things I do is I've been involved with financial investigations. The international drug traffickers used to covet U.S. dollars. That's no longer the case. They're moving into other currencies, especially the euro. So that's a sign, if you will, of the rats leaving the sinking ship. And the U.S. ability to enforce its will on countries like Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, India, China, I think it's being exposed as really an empty threat. So we've gotten away with bullying people for many years. I think the butcher's bill has come due on that. And what Russia has, I think, decided to do is wise in terms of serving Russia's national interests.
Last week, US officials admitted that a lot of the intelligence they release is not actually solid. For example, that Russia was allegedly planning to use chemical weapons in Ukraine. The Americans even said it was all part of some sort of psychological game with Vladimir Putin. What's your input on this, considering your experience at the CIA?
Our intelligence community is broken. If you recall, on the 30th of March, U.S. defense officials were leaking to the media that, there's dissension, there's chaos in Putin's inner circle. They lied to him. He's been deceived, and the economic pressure's growing, and they're deceiving the Russian people. So, and I know this for a fact that senior military personnel in the Pentagon seized upon this as true. Well, it turns out it was fake intel, I believe, fed by Russia to the West just to help confuse and divert. We've really lost a serious ability to analyze what's going on. I mean, just as a very simple example, the fact that Russia now has effectively seized the entire southern coast of Ukraine means that Ukraine, a major economic lifeline for Ukraine, is cut off. This is like having an artery in your leg severed. Who can survive long with that? That means Ukraine's economy is dead. It's not just suffering, it's dead, because without imports or exports, its ability to feed its people and to keep any kind of viable economy is reduced. Yet the intelligence community here is just oblivious to this kind of thing. They get focused, it's more often they're focused on identifying the specific veins in a leaf, as opposed to looking at what's happening to the forest.
Now, so far, there's been more airtime dedicated to the conflict in Ukraine on mainstream American outlets than there was on all the wars combined over the last 30 years. Why do you think that is?
If it bleeds, it leads. I mean, you've seen the media has actually, particular cable news channels in the United States, they've been losing audience share. So anytime you can hype violence and bloodshed and suffering, that makes it to the front, and the more you can show video images. What I find sort of interesting, and it's telling, is that normally, as you guys do with, what is it, Murad Gurdiev, your correspondent who is out in Mariupol, you see him, you see the cannons, the tanks firing, you see artillery going off, you see soldiers moving tactically. You don't see any kind of those video images from the Ukrainians. None of the Western media is embedded with any Ukrainian military units, because frankly, I think if they did videotape what's going on, it would be just terribly destructive to morale. You cannot conduct a war simply with psychological operations, and that appears to be what Ukraine has relied upon, making outlandish claims that a fighter pilot has shot down 6 Russian jets. Turns out that's from a video game, or that they've killed or captured 20 Russian generals. I mean, the lies go on. What I find shocking is I know for a fact that some of the key analysts in the U.S. intelligence community have been buying this nonsense. The question of skepticism towards these claims has not even arisen. So I think really the United States has become just a big, bloated, overfed, unhealthy blob. And it's gotten away with, we've been beating up on little brown people for 30 years. People that didn't have real air forces, didn't have real armies. And we've imagined ourselves to be extremely viable as a military force. But coming up against where essentially, as I see it, the Ukrainian army is fighting a proxy war for NATO, for the United States. We're finding out that everything that we thought the Ukrainians could do, they can't do, and Russia has been pretty effective at countering.
Really appreciate your time with us today. Larry C. Johnson, former CIA analyst, CEO of Berg Associates and commentator on national security topics. We appreciate your time.
Thanks, Nick.